Jake Harrison stood on the observation deck of Defense Station Alpha, watching the morning sun rise over New Terra's blue oceans. The colony world looked peaceful from orbit, with its white cities and green farmlands spreading across 3 continents. Ships moved between the orbital platforms like busy insects, carrying goods and people to dozens of other human worlds. Jake had been commander of the defense station for 5 years now. Most days were quiet, dealing with shipping schedules and routine patrols. The biggest excitement usually came from asteroid miners who drank too much and started fights in the station bars. Life was good in human space in the year 2387. The communications officer, a young woman named Beth Turner, looked up from her console with a frown. "Commander, we're getting some strange readings from the edge of the system. Long-range sensors are picking up massive energy signatures." Jake walked over to look at her screen. The display showed several large objects moving toward their system at incredible speed. "How big are we talking about?" "Sir, each contact is at least 10 kilometers long. I count 15 of them so far, with more appearing every minute." Beth's voice carried a note of worry that made Jake's stomach tighten. He had never seen ships that large before. The biggest human vessels were maybe 2 kilometers from nose to tail. "Sound general alert. Get me a direct line to Colonial Command. On Earth." Red lights began flashing throughout the station as Jake made his way to the main command center. His staff moved with practiced efficiency, bringing weapon systems online and preparing the station's defenses. Not that their weapons would do much good against ships the size of small moons. President Lisa Carter appeared on the main screen within minutes, her face grave. Behind her, Jake could see the busy activity of Earth's command center. "Commander?" "Harrison, we're tracking the same contacts here. Our deep space telescopes confirm at least 50 ships, possibly more. We have no idea who they are or what they want." "Have we tried to communicate with them?" Jake asked. "We've been broadcasting on all frequencies for the past hour. No response so far." The president paused as someone handed her a report. "Wait, we're getting something now." The screen flickered, and suddenly Jake was looking at something that made his blood run cold. The alien face had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern, skin like gray metal, and a mouth full of sharp teeth. When it spoke, the words came through, a translation device that made the voice sound flat and emotionless. "Primitive species of the 3rd planet and its colonies. I am Supreme Marshal Vextar of the Catharan Dominion. Your kind will submit to our rule within 72 of your hours. You will surrender all military vessels and weapons. You will provide 30% of your population for labor in our expansion projects. Resistance will result in total extinction." The image changed to show recordings of other worlds, other species that had faced the Catharans. Jake watched cities burning, populations being herded into transport ships, entire civilizations reduced to ash and slavery. The message was clear and brutal. "We have conquered 347 species across this galaxy. None have successfully resisted. Your primitive weapons and small numbers make resistance impossible. Comply, and some of your kind will survive as workers. Refuse, and all will die." The transmission ended, leaving the command center in shocked silence. Jake stared at the blank screen, his mind racing. 72 hours to decide the fate of humanity. Surrender and become slaves, or fight and face extinction. On Earth, President Carter was already in emergency session with the Colonial Defense Council. Admiral Kevin Stone, a tall man with gray hair and hard eyes, pounded his fist on the table. "We cannot surrender to these monsters. I've seen what they do to conquered species. Death would be better than slavery under the Kithrans." Dr. Amy Rodriguez, the chief scientist, shook her head. "We need to be realistic about our chances. They have technology far beyond ours, and their fleet outnumbers us 100 to 1. Maybe we can negotiate, find some middle ground." "There is no middle ground with creatures like these," Admiral Stone replied. "They've made their intentions clear: submit or die." Jake listened to the debate through his communication link while coordinating the evacuation of civilians from New Terra's orbital facilities. His staff worked around the clock, sending transport ships to the planet's surface loaded with families and children. If the worst happened, at least some would survive the initial assault. Captain Danny Wells of the patrol ship New Horizon was on routine patrol near the Kepler-7 mining station when the Kitharans struck their first target. He watched in horror as alien warships surrounded the mining platform and began systematically destroying it with bright blue energy beams. "This is Captain Wells to any human vessel," he broadcast on emergency frequencies. "The aliens are attacking Kepler-7. They're not trying to capture it, they're just killing everyone." The mining station housed 50,000 people, workers and their families who had spent years building a new life among the asteroids. Danny watched helplessly as escape pods launched from the dying station, only to be picked off by alien fighters, like clay pigeons at a shooting range. "They're not even taking prisoners," Danny reported, his voice shaking. "They're just murdering everyone they can find." The news reached Earth and every human colony within hours. The Kitharans had shown their true nature. This was not conquest in any civilized sense. It was extermination disguised as an ultimatum. They wanted humanity to surrender so they could destroy them more efficiently. President Carter addressed the human species in a broadcast that reached every world, every ship, every outpost in human space. She stood behind the podium in the White House, her face calm despite the terrible weight of her words. "My fellow humans, we face the greatest challenge in our species' history. An alien empire demands our surrender and slavery. They have shown us what happens to those who comply. They work their slaves to death and dispose of them like broken tools." She paused, looking directly into the camera. "I will not ask you to choose between freedom and safety because the Kitharans offer neither. They offer only different kinds of death, some quick, some slow, but death all the same. Therefore, I speak not just as your president, but as a human being who refuses to kneel before monsters. We will not surrender. We will not submit. We will fight with everything we have, and if we must die, we will die as free people standing on our feet." Across human space, the response was immediate and unanimous. Colony governors, ship captains, station commanders, and ordinary citizens all gave the same answer. They would rather face extinction than live as slaves. Jake Harrison looked out at the Kitharan fleet gathering at the edge of the system. The alien ships were massive and terrible, bristling with weapons that could crack planets. His small defense station and its handful of patrol craft would last maybe minutes against such overwhelming force. But as he watched, more human ships began arriving. Freighters converted to carry weapons, mining vessels fitted with makeshift armor, passenger liners loaded with volunteers ready to fight. They came from every direction, streaming toward New Terra to join the hopeless battle. Beth Turner looked up from her communications console with tears in her eyes and pride in her voice. "Commander, we're receiving messages from across the sector. Every human ship that can fly is coming to help us." Jake nodded, watching the growing fleet of improvised warships taking position around his station. They had no chance against the Kitharan armada, but they would make their stand anyway. That was what humans did when faced with impossible odds. They stood together and faced the darkness with courage. The 72-hour deadline was almost up, and the galaxy was about to learn what happened when someone tried to break humanity. The Kitharan attack began exactly 72 hours after their ultimatum, striking 12 human systems at once. Their warships moved like a plague across space, overwhelming human defenses with devastating precision. Each alien vessel carried enough firepower to level continents, and they used it without mercy. Captain Maria Santos watched from the bridge of her flagship as the Kitharan fleet entered the Vega system. Her 30 ships formed a defensive line around her homeworld, but they looked like toys compared to the massive alien dreadnoughts. Each enemy vessel was 5 times larger than her biggest ship, and there were over 100 of them. All ships. "This is Captain Santos," she broadcast to her small fleet. "I know we're outnumbered and outgunned. I know some of you have families down there, people you want to protect, but running won't save them. The only chance our people have is if we buy them time to evacuate." The first Kitharan salvo lit up space with deadly blue energy. Maria's ships scattered, using every trick they knew to avoid the alien weapons, but it was like trying to dodge rain in a thunderstorm. The destroyer New Boston took a direct hit and exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the darkness. Down on Vega Prime, the evacuation was in chaos. Transport ships landed at spaceports and city centers, loading as many people as they could carry. Children cried for their parents. Families were separated in the rush, but somehow the evacuation continued. No one pushed or fought for space on the ships. Instead, adults helped load children first, and the elderly made sure younger people got seats before them. Ben Turner was loading his construction crew onto a transport when the first alien bombs hit the capital city. The flash was visible from 300 kilometers away, followed by a mushroom cloud that rose into the atmosphere. In seconds, 2 million people were gone, including Ben's sister and her family. "Get on the ship," his foreman shouted over the noise of approaching aircraft. "We have to go now." But Ben was staring at the burning city, thinking about all the people still trapped there. "No," he said quietly. "No, we're not leaving anyone behind." Before anyone could stop him, Ben was running toward a group of abandoned construction vehicles. If the aliens wanted to destroy his world, they would have to work for it. He started up the biggest excavator and began digging fire breaks around the remaining refugee centers. Other workers joined him, using bulldozers and cranes to build barriers that might protect people from the alien bombardment. In space, Captain Maria Santos knew her fleet was dying. Half her ships were gone, and the rest were badly damaged. The smart thing would be to retreat, to save what was left of her forces for another battle. But when she looked down at her burning homeworld, she could see the construction vehicles still working, still trying to save people even as death rained from the sky. "All ships form up on my position," she ordered. "We're going in." Her communications officer stared at her. "Captain, that's suicide. We can't hurt those big ships with what we have left." Maria smiled grimly as she watched another transport lift off from the planet's surface, carrying 1,000 more refugees to safety. "Maybe not, but we can make them pay attention to us instead of the evacuation ships." The surviving human vessels charged straight at the Catharan fleet in a desperate attack that had no hope of success. They knew they were going to die, but they also knew that every minute the aliens spent destroying them was another minute for the transports to escape. The human ships fought like wounded animals, ramming alien vessels when their weapons ran out, detonating their own reactors to damage enemy hulls. It was hopeless and glorious and completely insane, and it bought precious time for the people below. Captain Maria Santos died when her ship's bridge took a direct hit, but not before she saw the last transport clear the atmosphere. Her sacrifice saved 50,000 lives, and her name would be remembered as long as humans existed. On New Terra, Jake Harrison watched the reports coming in from across human space. Every colony was under attack, and they were losing everywhere. The Kitharans had superior numbers, better weapons, and centuries of experience in conquest. By any logical measure, humanity should surrender now and hope for mercy. But humans had never been particularly logical when their backs were against the wall. The news from occupied territories painted a grim picture. The Catharans had landed troops on captured worlds and were implementing their standard control procedures. They separated families, sending adults to labor camps while taking children away for what they called educational restructuring. Anyone who resisted was killed immediately, and their bodies were left in public places as warnings. Ben Turner found himself leading a resistance cell on occupied Vega Prime almost by accident. After the orbital bombardment, he had helped organize rescue efforts in the ruined cities. When the alien troops arrived, he naturally became the person others looked to for guidance. He had no military training and no experience in warfare, but he understood people and he understood construction. "They've set up their command post in the old city center," he told his group of 30 volunteers. "It's protected by force fields and guard towers, but I know those buildings. I helped build half of them. There are maintenance tunnels that run right under their position." The Kitharans had conquered hundreds of species, but they had never faced humans before. Their psychological warfare tactics were designed to break the will of their enemies through systematic oppression and terror. They expected humans to follow the same patterns as other species, becoming more compliant as the costs of resistance increased. Instead, they discovered that humans became more dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. Ben's first attack was simple but effective. His team used the maintenance tunnels to place explosive charges under the alien command center during the night shift change. The explosion didn't kill many aliens, but it sent a clear message that humans would not submit quietly to occupation. The Kitharan response was predictable and brutal. They rounded up 100 random civilians and executed them in the city square, then announced that for every act of resistance, more innocents would die. This strategy had worked on every other species they had conquered. With humans, it had the opposite effect. Instead of turning against the resistance, the civilian population began actively supporting them. People shared food with the fighters, provided information about alien movements, and hid weapons in their homes. When the Kitharans increased their patrols, humans developed new ways to avoid detection. When the aliens installed surveillance systems, humans found ways to disable them. Dr. Amy Rodriguez was working around the clock in her hidden laboratory on Luna, analyzing every piece of Kitharan technology she could get her hands on. The aliens had superior weapons and faster ships, but their real advantage was psychological. They had perfected the art of breaking enemy morale through precise application of fear and despair. "They're not just conquerors," she explained to President Carter during a coded transmission. "They're psychological specialists. Every species they've defeated followed the same pattern: initial resistance, brutal retaliation, gradual submission, as the costs became too high." "But we're not following the pattern," Carter replied. "Our people are fighting harder now than they did at the beginning." Amy nodded, staring at her data screens. "That's what has me worried. The Kitharans have conquered 347 species using the same methods. If those methods don't work on us, they'll try something else, something worse." On occupied worlds across human space, the aliens were beginning to realize that humans were not behaving according to their models. Resistance was increasing instead of decreasing. Civilians were protecting fighters instead of betraying them. Most disturbing of all, humans continued to help each other even when cooperation brought punishment. Supreme Marshal Vextar studied the reports from his occupation, forces with growing frustration. Human behavior made no sense according to Kitharan understanding of rational species development. They should have broken by now, should have accepted that resistance was futile and submission was their only chance of survival. Instead, human resistance was spreading to other species within the Dominion. The Zelthrani slave workers had begun, sabotaging their mining operations after hearing stories of human defiance. The Korthak breeding colonies were showing signs of unrest for the first time in centuries. Even some Kitharan soldiers were beginning to question orders when they saw how humans treated prisoners of war. Jake Harrison received an encrypted message from Admiral Stone that changed everything. Hidden shipyards throughout human space were working at maximum capacity, building new vessels from civilian ships and salvaged alien technology. The fleet would never match Kitharan numbers, but it didn't need to. It just needed to prove that humanity would never stop fighting. Operation Prometheus Rising, Admiral Stone explained during a holographic briefing that included every surviving human commander. Simultaneous attacks on every major Kitharan position. We're not trying to win this war with one battle. We're trying to send a message that echoes across the galaxy. Jake looked around at the other commanders attending the briefing. They represented the survivors of dozens of battles, men and women who had watched their homes burn and their friends die, but who refused to surrender. 6 months had passed since the Kitharan invasion began, and the galaxy was watching something unprecedented unfold. Half of human space lay under alien occupation, but instead of the expected collapse of resistance, something else was happening. The humans were becoming more dangerous, more united, and more determined with each passing day. Ben Turner crouched in the ruins of what had once been Vega Prime's central library, planning his latest operation against the Kitharan occupation forces. His resistance cell had grown from 30 volunteers to over 300, including people from every walk of life. Former teachers worked alongside mechanics, doctors fought next to farmers, and corporate executives took orders from construction workers. "The supply convoy comes through Sector 7 every third day," explained Nancy Clark, a former elementary school teacher who had become one of their best intelligence gatherers. 12 transport vehicles, usually escorted by 4 combat drones. They're carrying power cells for the alien command centers. Ben studied the rough map drawn on a piece of salvaged metal. How many civilians in the area? Maybe 200 families still living in that district. The Kithrans moved most people to the labor camps, but some managed to hide in the underground shelters. This was always the hardest part of planning any operation. The aliens had made it clear that they would retaliate against civilians for any resistance activity, but the civilians themselves kept demanding that the resistance continue fighting. Every time Ben suggested that they should reduce their attacks to protect innocent people, those same innocents told him to hit the aliens harder. Steve Phillips, a former mechanic who had lost his wife and children in the first bombing, spoke up from the corner where he was assembling improvised explosives. The people in Sector 7 are the same ones who've been hiding our weapons and feeding our fighters. They know the risks, and they want us to make this strike. Ben nodded grimly. This was what the Kitharans could not understand about humans. Other species fought for survival, but humans fought for each other. When the aliens threatened civilians to stop resistance activities, the civilians themselves became part of the resistance. The attack on the supply convoy went perfectly. Ben's team used the city's old storm drain system to move into position undetected, then struck with precision that would have impressed professional soldiers. They destroyed the convoy and captured enough alien power cells to keep their equipment running for months. The Kitharan response was swift and brutal. They selected 200 civilians at random and executed them in the city's main square, broadcasting the killings across the occupied zone. The message was clear. Resistance brings death to innocence. But instead of breaking the human spirit, the executions had the opposite effect. More people joined the resistance, not fewer. Families who had tried to stay neutral began providing safe houses and intelligence. Children too young to fight became message runners and lookouts. The occupation force found itself surrounded by an entire population that had decided death was preferable to submission. Colonel Rick Barnes commanded the human assault on the prison moon of Titan 7, where the Kitharans were holding thousands of captured humans. His attack force was composed entirely of volunteers from across human space, people who had lost everything but refused to lose hope. They had no military transport, so they converted mining ships and freight haulers into improvised assault vehicles. The prison moon was heavily defended, with orbital weapon platforms and energy barriers protecting the main facility. Any conventional attack would have been suicide, but Rick's force was not conventional by any measure. They used tactics that confused and frustrated the alien defenders, approaching from unexpected angles and using equipment in ways it was never designed for. Remember, Rick told his team as they prepared for the final assault, we're not trying to defeat their entire garrison. We just need to get our people out and prove that no human is ever truly lost as long as the rest of us are willing to fight for them. The battle for Titan 7 lasted 18 hours and cost the lives of half the assault force, but they succeeded in freeing every human prisoner. More importantly, they rescued several Kitharan scientists who had been studying human psychology for their superiors. These aliens were beginning to question everything they had been taught about conquest and dominance. Dr. Amy Rodriguez was working with these defected Kitharan scientists in her hidden laboratory, learning more about the alien empire than humanity had ever known before. The most important discovery was also the most disturbing. The Kitharan Dominion was not just militarily superior. They were psychological specialists who had perfected the art of breaking enemy morale. Every species follows the same pattern, explained Zeknor, a former Kitharan psychological warfare expert who had requested asylum after witnessing human behavior that contradicted everything he had been taught. Initial resistance driven by survival instincts, followed by gradual submission as the costs of fighting exceed the benefits of freedom. Amy studied the aliens' data on previous conquests. The pattern was depressingly consistent across hundreds of different species and thousands of years of Kitharan expansion. But humans aren't following the pattern. That is correct, Zeknor replied, his 4 eyes blinking in what Amy had learned was a sign of confusion among his species. Human resistance increases under pressure rather than decreasing. Your people help each other even when cooperation brings punishment. Most incomprehensibly, you fight harder for abstract concepts like freedom and dignity than you do for mere survival. This revelation changed Amy's entire approach to analyzing the war. The Kitharans were not just using superior technology to defeat humanity. They were using psychological warfare that had proven successful against every other species in the galaxy. The fact that it was failing against humans suggested something unique about human nature that even humans themselves did not fully understand. Jake Harrison had been presumed dead when New Terra fell to the Kitharans, but he had actually been organizing something unprecedented in the asteroid fields beyond the occupied worlds. Using salvage technology, captured alien equipment, and sheer human ingenuity, he was building a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The ships of Jake's Ghost Fleet were barely recognizable as military vessels. Mining platforms had been fitted with weapons salvaged from destroyed Kitharan ships. Civilian transports had been converted into missile platforms using improvised launch systems. Even pleasure craft had been turned into reconnaissance vessels capable of slipping past alien detection systems. "We're not trying to match them ship for ship," Jake explained to his captains during a strategy meeting held in the converted cargo bay of a former ice hauler. "We're trying to prove that humanity cannot be conquered, cannot be controlled, and will never stop fighting for freedom." The Ghost Fleet's first major operation was a coordinated strike against Kitharan supply lines throughout the occupied territories. They hit targets the aliens never expected to be threatened, using tactics that defied conventional military doctrine. Most importantly, they broadcast their attacks across the galaxy, letting every enslaved species know that resistance was possible. Supreme Marshal Vexitar was experiencing something completely new in his long career of conquest: doubt. His psychological, warfare advisors could not explain human behavior according to any known model of rational species development. Worse, reports from across the Dominion indicated that human resistance tactics were spreading to other enslaved species. The Zelthrani mining colonies have reduced productivity by 40%, reported his chief administrator. The Korthak breeding facilities are experiencing unprecedented unrest. Even our own soldiers are requesting transfers away from human-occupied territories. Vexitar studied the holographic displays showing the current state of the war. By every conventional measure, the Kitharans were winning. They controlled most human territory, had captured millions of prisoners, and possessed overwhelming military superiority. Yet somehow they were losing the most important battle, the battle for the spirit of the conquered. "What do the humans want?" he asked his psychological advisor. "Every species we have conquered has eventually accepted reality and submitted to our rule. What makes these creatures different?" The advisor, a being whose own species had been conquered centuries ago, considered the question carefully. "Marshal, I believe the humans are fighting for something we have never encountered before. They are not fighting for survival or even for victory. They are fighting for the right to remain who they are, even if it kills them." This concept was almost incomprehensible to the Kitharan leadership. In their experience, all intelligent species were fundamentally rational actors who would choose survival over principle when faced with extinction. The idea of a species that would choose death over submission challenged the very foundation of their empire. As the reports continued to arrive from across occupied human space, a disturbing pattern became clear. Every attempt to break human morale through traditional methods was not only failing, but actually strengthening human resistance. Public executions led to increased recruitment for resistance cells. Forced separation of families resulted in more coordinated opposition activities. The second year of the Kitharan occupation began with something the alien empire had never experienced in 2,000 years of conquest: a galaxy-wide rebellion. What had started as human resistance was now spreading like wildfire across hundreds of worlds where enslaved species had watched humans refuse to break under the worst oppression imaginable. Admiral Kevin Stone stood in the command center of New Olympus, a massive fortress built inside a hollowed-out asteroid that had become the secret capital of free humanity. Around him, holographic displays showed the positions of ships and resistance cells across the galaxy. The sight should have been depressing, given how outnumbered they remained, but Kevin felt something he had not experienced since the war began. Hope. "Report from the Zelthrani mining colonies," announced Lieutenant Paula Davis from her communication station. "They've declared independence and are requesting human advisors to help organize their defense forces, the Korthak breeding worlds. Have expelled all Catheran administrators," added Communications Officer Gary Walsh. "They're asking for copies of our resistance training materials." Kevin smiled grimly as he studied the tactical displays. The Catheran Empire was facing rebellions on over 200 worlds, and more species were joining the revolt every day. It was not that humans had defeated the aliens in battle. They had shown other enslaved races that the Kitharans could be resisted. "Sir," called out Intelligence Officer Linda Foster, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Captain Santos." Kevin turned in surprise. Maria Santos had been reported killed during the defense of the Vega system over a year ago. Her appearance on the main screen was like seeing a ghost, but a very welcome ghost. She looked older and bore new scars, but her eyes still burned with the same determination that had made her a legend among human forces. "Admiral Stone, this is Captain Maria Santos commanding the Liberation Fleet. We're approaching Earth's outer system with 300 ships representing 17 different species. Request permission to join the defense of our homeworld." Kevin stared at the screen in amazement. "Captain, we thought you were dead. How did you survive Vega?" Maria's smile was grim but proud. "My ship was destroyed, but I was rescued by a Zelthrani freighter. I've spent the last year building alliances with every species that wants to be free of Catharan rule. We're not just fighting for humanity anymore, Admiral. We're fighting for everyone." The news that Captain Santos was alive and leading a multi-species fleet sent waves of excitement through every human stronghold. More importantly, it proved that the galaxy was changing in ways the Kytherans had never anticipated. For the first time in their history, an empire built on domination was facing coordinated resistance from dozens of species working together. On occupied Earth, the Kytheran forces were discovering that conquering the human homeworld was very different from controlling it. The planet had become a fortress where every city, every building, and every street corner was defended by people who refused to surrender. Paul Mitchell had been a civilian engineer before the invasion, designing bridges and buildings for peaceful purposes. Now he led teams that turned those same structures into defensive positions that frustrated alien occupation forces. His knowledge of Earth's infrastructure made him invaluable to the resistance. But more than that, his determination to protect his home inspired everyone around him. "They've reinforced their command center with shield generators," Paul explained to his team of volunteer fighters as they studied blueprints in an abandoned subway station. "But I helped design the power grid for this district. If we can overload the main transformer, their shields will fail for at least 10 minutes. The plan was dangerous and complex, requiring precise timing and perfect execution. Paul's team would have to fight their way through alien patrols, bypass security systems, and plant explosives while under fire from advanced weapons. Any military commander would have called it impossible, but Paul's team was not made up of professional soldiers. They were ordinary people who had decided that their home was worth any sacrifice. Linda Foster, a former corporate executive, had become an expert at forging alien identification cards. Carl Johnson, the retired teacher, coordinated communication between resistance cells using old ham radio equipment. Carol Hughes, an agricultural specialist, organized food distribution for displaced civilians. The attack on the alien command center succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. Not only did they destroy the shield generators, but they also captured a complete database of Kitharan military communications. For the first time since the invasion began, humans could intercept and decode enemy transmissions in real time. Dr. Amy Rodriguez had been working with captured Kitharan technology for months, but the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Zeknor, the defected alien psychologist, provided access to the Dominion's historical archives that revealed the Empire's greatest secret. They had never actually defeated any of the species they claimed to have conquered. "The Kitharan expansion is built on a lie," Amy explained during an encrypted broadcast to resistance leaders throughout the galaxy. "They don't conquer species through military superiority alone. They break the will to resist through psychological manipulation, then claim credit for victories that were achieved through surrender rather than defeat. This revelation changed everything. The Zelthrani had not been defeated in battle 3 centuries ago. They had been convinced that resistance was hopeless. The Korthak had not been conquered through superior force. They had been manipulated into believing submission was their only option for survival. Species after species had given up not because they could not fight, but because they believed they could not win. Humans are different, Amy continued. We don't fight because we think we can win. We fight because we believe some things are worth dying for. That makes us immune to the psychological warfare that has built the Kithrin Empire. Jake Harrison's Ghost Fleet had grown from a handful of improvised vessels to a force that struck terror into Kithrin supply lines throughout the occupied territories. His ships appeared without warning, hit targets that should have been impossible to reach, then vanished before enemy reinforcements could respond. More importantly, they carried Amy's broadcast to every world where enslaved species were beginning to remember what freedom felt like. This is Jake Harrison speaking to all who hear this transmission, he broadcast on captured Kithrin communication channels. The alien empire wants you to believe that resistance is futile, that submission is your only choice. They want you to think they are invincible. But we have seen their ships burn. We have watched their soldiers run. They can be defeated, but only if we stand together and refuse to kneel. The message reached not just human resistance fighters, but millions of enslaved beings throughout the Kitharan Dominion. For many species, it was the first time in generations they had heard anyone suggest that the Empire could be challenged. The effect was immediate and dramatic as rebellions broke out on worlds that had been peaceful for centuries. Supreme Marshal Vextar was receiving reports that challenged everything he understood about conquest and empire. His forces still controlled most human territory and possessed overwhelming military superiority. But they were losing the war in ways he had never imagined possible. The rebellion has spread to 1/3 of our territory, his chief administrator reported with barely concealed panic. Production in our mining colonies has collapsed. Our slave populations are openly defying orders. Even some of our own soldiers are requesting transfers away from combat zones. Vextar studied the tactical displays showing the current state of his empire. Red indicators marked worlds in open rebellion, yellow showed areas of civil unrest, and green represented only a handful of systems that remained fully under Kitharan control. The map looked like a disease spreading across the galaxy. How is this possible? He demanded. We have the largest fleet in galactic history. Our weapons can destroy planets. Our psychological warfare techniques have proven effective for 2 millennia. How can one primitive species cause this much disruption? His psychological advisor, now heavily guarded after several other Kitharan officials had defected to join human resistance cells, provided an analysis that shook the foundations of everything the Dominion believed. Marshal, the humans are not fighting according to any rational model of behavior. They continue resistance even when it brings certain death. They help strangers at the cost of personal safety. Most importantly, they have convinced other species that abstract concepts like freedom and dignity are worth any sacrifice. This was the Kitharans' worst nightmare, an enemy that could not be broken through traditional methods because they were motivated by principles rather than survival instincts. Every tactic that had worked on previous species not only failed against humans, but seemed to make them more determined. The situation became critical when reports arrived that human resistance tactics were being adopted by the Dominion's own client species. Kitharan allies who had served the Empire faithfully for centuries were beginning to question why they followed orders from conquerors, rather than making their own decisions. As the second anniversary of the invasion approached, both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive battle. The final battle for Earth began not with the clash of fleets but with something far more dangerous to the Kitharan Dominion, doubt spreading through their own ranks. Supreme Marshal Vextar arrived at Sol System with the largest armada ever, assembled over 1,000 warships carrying enough firepower to crack planets. But he could see the uncertainty in his officers' eyes. Marshal, his chief tactical officer reported nervously, our forward scouts report unusual activity throughout the human system. There are ships everywhere, but most of them appear to be civilian vessels converted for combat. Intelligence estimates over 10,000 craft of various sizes. Vextar studied the tactical display with growing unease. The human fleet was a chaotic mix of military vessels, converted freighters, mining platforms, and even pleasure craft fitted with improvised weapons. By all military doctrine, such a force should be easily swept aside. But something about the sheer audacity of it made his experienced commanders nervous. "They know they cannot win," his psychological advisor stated, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. This must be some form of mass suicide gesture designed to inspire their remaining forces. But Vextar had been studying human behavior for 2 years now, and he was beginning to understand that humans did not think like any other species the Dominion had encountered. They did not fight because they expected to win. They fought because they believed some things were worth dying for. Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, a converted asteroid mining platform that had been transformed into a command vessel for the improvised human fleet. Around him, holographic displays showed the positions of ships crewed by volunteers from every human world, many of them piloted by people who had never been in combat before, but who had refused to let others fight alone. "All ships, this is Commander Harrison," he broadcast to the massive fleet surrounding Earth. "Today we're not fighting to win a war. Wars can be lost and fought again. Today we're fighting to prove that some spirits cannot be broken, some principles cannot be compromised, and some people will never kneel to tyrants." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of voices replied at once, creating a chorus of defiance that reached across the solar system. They were teachers and farmers, engineers and shopkeepers, grandparents and teenagers, all united by the simple belief that freedom was worth any price. Captain Maria Santos commanded the multi-species liberation fleet that had traveled from across the galaxy to join the defense of Earth. Her ships represented 17 different races that had thrown off Kitharan rule, proving that the human example could inspire anyone willing to choose liberty over safety. "Human fleet, this is Captain Santos of the Liberation Alliance," she transmitted. "We stand with you not because we owe you anything, but because you showed us that chains can be broken if we have the courage to try." The Liberation Fleet included former Kitharan slave species that had not seen freedom for centuries, but their presence proved something more important than military support. It demonstrated that the human refusal to surrender had become a galactic movement that threatened the very foundation of the Dominion's power. On Earth itself, the planet had been transformed into a fortress defended not by professional armies, but by entire populations that had decided death was preferable to slavery. In New York, London, Tokyo, and every other major city, civilians had built barricades and prepared for urban warfare using tactics learned from 2 years of resistance fighting. Paul Mitchell coordinated the defense of the former United States from a command bunker built in the ruins of Washington, D.C. His engineering teams had turned the continent into a maze of obstacles, traps, and fortified positions that would make any invasion incredibly costly for the attackers. "They'll probably try to break our will with orbital bombardment first," he explained to his staff of volunteers. "But we've prepared for that. Every major population center has underground shelters connected by tunnel systems. They can destroy our cities, but they can't destroy our people's determination to be free." Carol Hughes managed agricultural production and food distribution from hidden facilities scattered across the American heartland. Her networks ensured that resistance, fighters, and civilian populations could continue operating even under siege conditions. More importantly, her broadcast reminded people throughout the occupied territories that humans were still planting crops and planning for the future, proving their confidence in ultimate victory. The battle began when Kitharan forces attempted their standard opening move, a massive orbital bombardment designed to break enemy morale through overwhelming displays of destructive power. Their energy weapons lit up Earth's atmosphere as they targeted military installations, major cities, and industrial centers. But something unprecedented happened. Instead of seeking shelter and cowering in fear, human populations came out into the open to watch the bombardment. They stood in streets and on rooftops, singing songs and holding hands, showing the alien invaders that their spirits could not be broken by any amount of violence. Carl Johnson's voice reached every human settlement through emergency broadcast, systems that had been built to survive nuclear warfare. Look up at the sky, my fellow humans. See those lights, those explosions, those ships. They represent everything the Catharans can throw at us. And we are still here. We are still free. We are still human. The orbital bombardment continued for 6 hours, but instead of weakening human resistance, it seemed to strengthen it. Rescue teams emerged from shelters before the all-clear signals were given, helping wounded neighbors and rebuilding damaged positions. Children drew pictures of alien ships being destroyed by human heroes. Elderly people shared stories of previous wars and how freedom had always triumphed over oppression in the end. Supreme Marshal Vextar watched these reports with something approaching panic. His psychological warfare experts had predicted that orbital bombardment would break human morale within hours, leading to mass surrenders and the collapse of organized resistance. Instead, humans were acting as if the attack had been a minor inconvenience rather than a demonstration of overwhelming force. Marshal, his communications officer, reported with obvious distress, "We're receiving surrender requests from our own fleet. Over 200 ships have asked permission to withdraw from combat operations." This was unprecedented in Catharan military history. Dominion forces had never refused to fight, had never questioned orders, had never shown anything but absolute obedience to their commanders. But watching humans face certain death with songs and defiance was affecting even veteran Catharan soldiers in ways their leaders had never anticipated. The turning point came when Jake Harrison led the human fleet in what military historians would later call the most insane tactical maneuver in recorded history. Instead of using conventional attack formations, the human ships charged directly at the center of the Catharan battle line in what appeared to be a mass suicide run. But it was not suicide. It was a demonstration. As the improvised human vessels closed with the alien dreadnoughts, their crews broadcast messages to the galaxy, explaining why they were willing to die. They spoke of children who deserved to grow up free, of principles that could not be compromised, of the simple human belief that some things were worth any sacrifice. These broadcasts reached not just other human forces, but Catharan crews throughout the enemy fleet. For many alien soldiers, it was the first time they had ever heard anyone explain why they chose death over submission. The concept was so foreign to Catharan thinking that it caused a psychological crisis throughout their command structure. "Why?" demanded Supreme Marshal Vextar during a direct communication with Jake Harrison as the human fleet approached his flagship. "Why do you choose extinction when we offer survival? Why do you throw away your lives for abstract concepts that bring no tangible benefit?" Jake's response was broadcast throughout both fleets and intercepted by resistance cells across the galaxy. "Marshal, you have conquered hundreds of species, but you have never understood what it means to be truly alive. We don't fight because we expect to survive. We fight because we choose to be human rather than slaves, and that choice is worth everything to us." The psychological effect on Catharan forces was immediate and devastating. Entire battle groups began refusing orders, demanding to know why they were killing people who demonstrated greater courage than their own officers. Alien soldiers who had served the Dominion for decades began asking questions that challenged the foundation of their empire's authority. Dr. Amy Rodriguez, now serving as humanity's chief diplomatic representative, requested a direct meeting with Supreme Marshal Vextar. The meeting took place aboard a neutral vessel with both sides bringing minimal security. What happened in that room changed the course of galactic history. "Marshal," Amy began, "your empire is built on the belief that conquest gives you the right to rule others. But we have proven that some people cannot be conquered, cannot be ruled, and will never accept. That might makes right." Vextar studied the human scientist with his 4 eyes, trying to understand how such a small, fragile creature could speak with such certainty when facing the most powerful military force in the galaxy. "You are outnumbered 1,000 to 1,